What would it take to eliminate poverty in Canada by the year 2030? This is the 2030 Project. It's a podcast that explores why poverty persists and what we can do about it in this country. We endeavor to uncover what's been successful with Canada's poverty reduction strategy, but then what needs to come next. The 2030 Project tackles some of the biggest and the most pressing social issues facing this country today. I'm Dave Trafford, and thanks for joining us. Over the past number of episodes, we have heard from frontline workers and social assistance recipients who will tell you that there are programs in place right now that are successfully reducing poverty rates in some demographics across Canada. But they've universally told us it's not enough. If we're going to have any hope of tackling poverty, there needs to be a floor that provides income stability. So it leads us to the main question in this episode of the 2030 Project. What role can a basic guaranteed income play in the ongoing mission to reduce, if not eliminate, poverty? Our guests for this session are John Wright. He's the Senior Vice President at Maru Public Opinion. Sheila Regehr chairs the Basic Income Canada Network. And Evelyn is an economist and professor in community health sciences at the University of Manitoba. Now, before we get into the issue and the question about basic guaranteed income, let's just get a sense from you, Evelyn, as to whether you think we're on a timeline of being able to realistically say that we can overcome poverty in this country.
I think we certainly have the capacity to reduce poverty rather dramatically. I think we've done a fairly good job with families with children under 18. The Canada Child Benefit has been a very positive contribution. I think support for seniors could be increased, but I think the programs themselves are very good, the Guaranteed Income Supplement and OAS. The great gap, of course, in the system is for people between the ages of 18 and 64 who, for one reason or another, are not attached to the labor market. In particular, people living outside families, people living by themselves. And I think we do have the capacity to do something about that. I'm not sure the will is there. And I think that's where we are right now.
Sheila?
I would echo that. We have the capacity. On the other side of things, I think if you look at all of the proposals that are out there seem to be some version of more of the same old thing and tinkering around the edges of programs that we know don't work. I was the executive director of the National Council of Welfare for a number of years. We produced reports on what has happened with welfare systems over time. There's no indication in any of that those kinds of systems can change. You can't make them better. The fundamental assumptions of them are wrong. And with a basic income and making sure that everybody is covered in the same way that seniors and families with kids are, then we have a shot at completely eliminating poverty in a really rapid turnaround time.
John, I know you've done sort of research on this and you've taken the pulse of Canadians over, pre-pandemic particularly, but even during the pandemic and over the course of the last election campaign, you noted that affordability was right at the top of the list for so many people. And I think we overthink this in terms of the poverty reduction side of it, that really that is one of those missions that we need to, adopt in terms of making life more affordable. It really is at the heart of reducing poverty.
And that's a very interesting concept because you stop talking about the word poverty and labeling people and you start talking about everybody's affordability. And I don't know how that plays into the natural debate, but there are some myths out there that we have to bust. I mean, there's about 1 in 5 people across this country that blame the poor for being in their own position. So I would like to look at it the other side. We've got almost 80% who say it's not their fault. I mean, it's a fault of other things. And you've got about, about on the other end, about 20% of Canadians who are having a great difficulty affording where they're going to go. So the polarization is at two ends of the scale. And I think overall, people are very sympathetic to this. They believe that, even the prisons. 3/4 of Canadians believe that the prisons are full of people who basically don't have income, and they come from poor families, and there's a lot of consequence in the communities. I mean, everybody's empathetic to this. The question then, of course, is who's going to pay for that? So when you ask people whether they're prepared to pay more taxes, about half the public says that they are. And then it becomes a question of degree. And I think so that goes back to your guess. And the question is, well, what do you want to do? And I did some work with Senator Siegel when he was looking at the income policies. And I think what I found was the greater the proportion you talk about, obviously, government contributing to programs, the less and less support there is. So if you say, will you pay a bit more taxes, you get about half the public saying that. I think that if you venture into what the parliamentary budget chief said recently, that it's going to cost $80 billion based on their program for the first year and $95 billion for the next year, I think you're going to get people to shy away, like automatically, because it's talking in the billions. And I know you can talk about good things in society, but everybody, it seems that 3/4 of the public breaks to where they normally do in these circumstances. You're not going to tax me, then tax the businesses, tax the corporations. They need to step up. 3/4 will say that. So it's not akin to the environment where everybody says, I'm in favor in saving the world, but don't make me pay more for it. I think the public is saying in this, I don't know what the dimension is. I don't know what we're really talking about. When you say things that we say about, affordable income or an income supplement or things like that, I don't think they understand how big the box we're talking about and how we're defining it. But the generalities across the country is they recognize it as an issue. They recognize that provincial governments don't have the way to fund things the way that they should be done. Like, that's all there. But I think it's how we define the debate. And I think, Dave, you've touched on something. When you talk about the affordability of living in Canada at this time, and just to end up this, I track every month a 60-day outlook for Canadians and where they're headed and what they're doing. I think when you talk about the affordability as opposed to the income of people or the poverty level, you broaden the base of support. It just becomes broader because they can relate to it and there are more people. So maybe it has something to do with how we talk about it as kind of the elites as opposed to how the public really needs to understand it.
Yeah, I saw a piece recently where you were presenting, Evelyn, and you one of the key bullets on your presentation was to say, let's all understand exactly what we're talking about here before we get too far into the conversation. And I think to John's point, if we're not careful, even the whole idea of a basic income becomes a stigma label.
I'm not quite sure how to respond to that. I'm not sure why basic income would be a stigma. I think that the stigma comes from the way that various programs interact with people. And I think that one of the benefits of a basic income is the amount of money you receive depends only on your other resources. It depends only on your other income. So you're not dealing with the stigmatizing interaction that provincial income assistance programs, for example, impose on people, where needs testing becomes very intrusive and very demeaning for people who are involved. So I'm not sure that I'd buy that argument about basic income being stigmatizing. I would like to respond to some of the comments made about cost, though, if I can. I think one thing that people don't understand is how much we're currently paying for programs that are designed to address poverty in one way or another. Either upfront programs that are intended to give money to people or to give support to people, or down the road, because so many of our programs cost more because of poverty, the cost of the healthcare system, for example, the cost of prisons. And I think once you start realizing how costly poverty is to a society, then suddenly it starts to make a lot more sense to put money up front and to get money into people's hands so they can make reasonable decisions about their lives.
Yeah, I guess, Sheila, that whole idea of a return on investment is something that we can all appreciate at whatever stage of our lives we're at, economically or otherwise. And but what's important here, though, as I think, is that it's not viewed even as a hand up. This becomes almost a redistribution of resources in many ways. But we're going to have to break the system to some degree to make this work.
we could talk about breaking the system, but I think what's really important about a basic income is that it is the solution to a lot of things that are already broken, as Evelyn has described. I'd kind of like to go back a little bit to the issue of affordability and poverty. So one of the things that we're doing in the movement, I mean, different people are trying to appeal to different audiences, to reach people where they are. Again, way back when I was at the National Council of Welfare, I mean, we had a mandate to look at poverty, so we had to talk about poverty. But we learned through polling and things, it doesn't sell. As John said, it doesn't resonate with a lot of people. The issue of affordability really does. And I think affordability is even kind of a trivializing concept. I think we're really talking about massive inequality in our society that we failed to address, and huge amounts of insecurity that people do understand. A lot of people understand that when COVID happened, if CERB benefits hadn't come along to save a whole lot of people who would never have imagined coming close to poverty, if it hadn't saved them, I mean, their lives would really have been upended. So we realize that our systems are not working to provide the security that people need. And then you've got a lot of people who look like they're doing really well and they're living on debt. And so they've got that insecurity too, that if things start going wrong, they could lose it all. And that's the problem in Canada. We need that floor. It's not a handout. It's not a hand up. It's a floor of security that everybody can depend on so that you can build a life from it.
Well, Evelyn, when we look at it from that perspective, and I think that's an important, point to say, it's a floor, and I've heard you say that before as well. The idea that we are going to take this, though, as one tool in the kit. This can't be the only weapon we've got to solve the problem.
Absolutely. I think if you look at the way we actually deliver services and supports in this country, the federal government is really very good at handing out cash. It's really very good at taxing and distributing income to people. The provinces are largely involved in the delivery of in-kind services. And this is where we run into difficulty with provincial income assistance. Provinces aren't very good at that, as it happens. And the programs themselves aren't very good because they end up getting muddled in a variety of ways. Basic income shifts to the federal government, I think, shifts to higher levels of government, the responsibility for ensuring that people have enough income to make decisions about their lives.
Well, and I guess then we get into this whole discussion, John, and it seems eternal, right? The feds not wanting to step on the province's territory, or the provinces quickly saying, you're cutting my grass here, back up. And this is probably why, I mean, where we need one throat to choke is probably here more than anywhere else, and it will be eternally difficult to get to that point.
I suppose, Dave, but I don't think there's been a time in the last 120 years where we've had government spending as much as they have. And I mean, there's that phrase, don't waste a good crisis. I mean, we have more people across this country affected than ever. We're going to have the government of Canada, whose Liberal Party put poverty reduction and basic income as the second policy in their last April meeting, and yet it showed up nowhere. I mean, I think what we're going to see when the federal government begins to reduce some of the CERB payments, and I'm not one that says that everybody's not working because it's CERB. I mean, we've reduced our natural immigration levels by 2/3 almost, and there's all the people there who would normally be coming into this country to actually work at those low levels of pay, which we're trying to address. But I think there's a way to reset the agenda, and I'm a great believer that it all revolves around context and the kind of way you talk about it. So again, I remember doing the earliest polling on the phrase private-public partnership. I remember doing that, like I did all that stuff for the provinces, and there was a stigmatization of the word that came about within the first couple of years. And I remember going to the provincial government, to a group of Ontario, and presenting to a room full of people, policy people, on the topic. And I used different words to describe what it was. And I think I ended up with something that was like sustainable collaborative financing, which sounds kind of goopy, but when you said that to the public, about 84% of them accepted it as something that they would be in support of. So I think we have to think about how we're talking about that. We also have to put it in the context of what opportunities we have, because we have the recognition that people have been damaged during the pandemic and that they are going to be left behind if we don't have some involvement of governments. And we've actually seen more collaboration between the federal and provincial governments probably at any other time since the Great Depression. So I think there's a window here, and I think it has to be carefully threaded in terms of how we talk about it, how we negotiate it between, maybe it's a collaborative venture between the federal provincial governments. Let me just leave on this. I don't think there's anything the current federal government won't finance over the next 2.5 years, because they're going to be tilting as far left as they can to pick up support from the NDP and from others. So now's the time, but I think we have to understand how to thread it and how to present it so that both provinces and the federal government can do something about it.
So, Sheila, if we're looking at this, then is this really an age of opportunity? I mean, and not one that we have seen, and nobody's cheering for COVID, but let's face it, it has highlighted much of what you and certainly Evelyn have been talking about. But at the same time, this is still going to require a certain level of political courage and vision. And not to cast aspersions on any one political party here, but we have not seen a great deal of that in the last 20 years.
You're right about the last 20 years, but you're also right, I think, about COVID. And to John's point, too, I mean, let's not waste a good crisis. What has been brewing all along has simply been highlighted by COVID. Like, we know this. On the political level, though, I think things really have changed within the past couple of years, enormously. John had mentioned Hugh Segal before. He was like the lone voice in the wilderness for the longest time. And then there were a small group of us. Our organization was formed along with Hugh in 2008. There were a few more voices. Today, there are voices everywhere, except among the leaders of some of the parties who have the power to actually make this happen. So, I mean, just to go through a really short list, you've got the report on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, showing that this is a huge issue for them and for Indigenous populations. They are calling for a basic income. You've got the United Church and other faith and multi-faith-based organizations who have been calling for basic income for years. You've got youth. You've got Black Lives Matter. You've got environmentalists. You've got public health were amongst the first institutional supporters of the basic income movement. So I think you've got this real groundswell, and now you've got all of these people who would have, fallen into really hard times were it not for CERB. So you've got this mass of people who should be able to understand it if we can get the federal government to cast it right and build support for it. So within the House, within Parliament now, you've got Kim Pate and a whole group of 50 senators who are, firmly supporting this, and real champions. You've had champions in the Green Party, in the NDP, and the Liberals, like within their caucuses. So, I think the support really is growing and the noise is getting louder. It's up to our leaders to listen.
So, Evelyn, clearly the devil is in the detail here. It's this higher view of the guaranteed or basic income as a conversation starter is one thing. And I sort of share Sheila's sort of view of this, and just from stepping back and observing, I think most people would look at it and say, okay, this is a conversation we must have and we need to pursue. But once you get down into the detail, that's going to be the hard sell point. So I'm going to just allow you to, all of it right now, you're going to give advice to the new government. What are the three things that are going to help them communicate this better, to frame it so that most Canadians can say, yep, I understand that. Let's move this on and get the agenda on board?
Oh, gosh, I'm terrible at sound bites. But let me say that I think everybody recognizes employment insurance is dysfunctional. And they've been trying to reform it. They've been trying to reform it since it was put in place. They're currently trying to reform it. We're coming out of this pandemic. Later, we will come out of this pandemic, but we need an employment insurance program of some sort that actually meets the needs of people, and in particular, people who are working in precarious jobs, people in short-term contracts, people without the kind of standard jobs that used to exist in the past. We need a way of dealing with that. And basic income, I think, does a very good job of dealing with that group of people. We have so many limitations in existing programs. We need a basic income, I think, to fill the gaps, to ensure that people facing similar kinds of situations receive the same kind of support. We also have the very real recognition, I think, that all of the provinces are in deep financial difficulty. There is going to be a shoveling of money from the federal government to the provinces one way or another over the next several years. We're seeing it with the child care decision. We will see it with healthcare going forward. And I think one of the things that we ought to be thinking about is how we can better share the responsibility of providing basic income support to people going forward. So I think that there are a lot of opportunities to think about how we can do a better job of trying to do what our existing programs don't do very well. They might have worked more or less at some point in the past, but they certainly are dysfunctional at this stage.
Well, Evelyn, let me just follow up on that then and ask you, because some of the dysfunction comes, as well-intended as the system may be, it gets in its own way to the point where
Absolutely.
You almost incentivize people to stay on the social assistance program because it discourages you from going into the workplace because it claws back your money, it claws back your benefit. So I'm thinking that if we're going to have a basic income, we're going to have to immediately deal with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one place to look is support for people with disabilities. I think that it's very, very difficult for people people who can and want to work to be able to work because of the fear of losing other supports with that program. And so it doesn't surprise me that one of the ways that we're moving forward is talking about some kind of a new benefit for people with disabilities. This is an opportunity to implement, I think, some of the principles of basic income for this particular group of Canadians and to watch how well it works. And I think that there are other opportunities coming forward.
Sheila, there's some urgency about this, though, and John talks about that 2.5 year runway because we're talking about currently a minority parliament, but that sounds like a long time to be waiting.
Urgency has a sort of double meaning, I think, around basic income. One, that we really do have an urgent need for it, because coming out of COVID and as CERB starts to wind down with, as Evelyn explained, with existing programs that aren't working very well, we're going to have an increasing problem as we go forward. So that urgency, all of the unsolved problems are still going to be there. But the other aspect of urgency is that basic income delivers benefit really, really quickly. So it's a policy that can work urgently to help turn people's lives around. And, we have stories from people who are on CERB who have talked about that. We have people who are in pilot projects who have talked about how quickly their lives turned around. Having that stability, being able to eat better, to improve their health, to get off medications, we really can transform people's lives quite quickly with this policy. And if I can add just one more thing, back to the federal, provincial, territorial kind of ballpark, we've done this. We should have so much confidence in Canada. I don't know why we lack it. We've done this with child benefits. This new child benefit system came about through federal, provincial, territorial agreements. It did take federal leadership to do it, and it did pull people out of the social assistance system. So this idea that a basic income is something new and different that's going to interfere with provincial responsibility just doesn't make sense. We can use a basic income to help make sure that everybody is covered under one system. and then the rest adapts, and we can adapt positively to all of this change as people do better.
I want to go back to maybe it's an opportunity, but it's also a self-realization that the pandemic has closed the door. I want to address immigration for a moment, because oftentimes the face of poverty is in those who are newcomers or are trying to get their families up the rung. I mean, there's two different groups. There's those with disabilities or those who have been relegated to the sidelines because of functional circumstances in their own lives and society. And we have to look after that. But isn't it interesting nowadays that, businesses are crying out for people? I mean, there's not a day that goes by that you say, I can't find enough people to serve tables. And yet, as I said, we're only letting in a third of the people. There was a period of time for many months where we weren't letting anybody in. And when I go through the list of people that we are crying for, it's like parcel pushers, tomato pickers, chicken packers, hotel cleaners, kitchen workers, parking attendants. Those are usually first entry rung jobs where people are living, 8 to an apartment somewhere, and they're trying to get their first living. So there's almost an interesting nexus that we're dealing with where, and I'm not suggesting that all is rosy where everybody goes out and say, well, let's tax Amazon and that's going to solve all our problems. But there is a gain coming out of this pandemic, and it may be when Toronto's reporting 400 cases a day now instead of 1,500, that there's a different realization of who this is. We've laid bare the necessity that we have to pay people properly, to give them benefits, to make sure that they're cared for. And if that costs us, parts of our economy because they're not doing it properly, those who do will win. So I just, you come to the realization the pandemic has really stripped clear those people who really need to work. And it's not all about CERB. It's about who comes here and who gets to start moving through society.
Just before we wrap up, and I want to kind of riff off that point, John, because the criticism has been around CERB, and I hear it talked about as vis-a-vis basic income, is that if you give folks that money, they won't want to work. They'll just sit on their rear end at home and, smoke it away or drink beer or whatever it is. I mean, there's that sort of stereotype. But my sense from what you talked about, John, in terms of your own research, is that for the most part, nobody wants to do that. I mean, we all kind of want to have purpose in our lives. And so many of us are defined by what we do and who we do it with.
I think there's anecdotal evidence that, what's happening, or people are staying home. We know the political imperative for the Liberal Party was to hold on to and make sure that the election happened before, the CERB thing started to fall off. And it remains to be seen whether they'll taper down on these things because they will rely on the NDP. But I think it's contrasted with the other statistics that you hear, and I don't know how believable the wording is on how they do it. But when you hear, well-respected government institutions like Statistics Canada saying, we've got back 90% of the jobs we had before the pandemic. Well, does that just mean we got 10% on CERB? Does that mean that there's, still space for people to go? There's something else happening here. And I think the public is going to be confused when you say we've made all the jobs back. Maybe they're all half time. But if we've made all those back, who are the people who are on CERB? What is the percentage? And what is the government going to do when it starts to taper off? It'll be interesting to see whether they go the whole way. I don't think so. But how do they stream it down? I don't even know whether they will or not.
Sheila, what's your thought? I mean, that's a common chorus that, well, if you give those people money, they're not going to want to work anyway.
I think it's really interesting that John has tied this into immigration, because one of the things that you will see historically is that with every wave of immigration into our countries in North America, people have been called lazy or greedy or slovenly, all of those things. A lot of this really is based on discrimination. There's simply no evidence that this holds up. And what we see again from our child benefit programs and from the basic income pilots, that with a little more security, stability, and income, people actually work more. They get better jobs. They're able to do more. Their opportunities open up. So it's a widening and an opening. If we have to sacrifice a few really horrible low-paid jobs in our economy for that, I think that makes imminent sense. That if we have more security and freedom for everybody and give everybody a better chance, then we're all better off.
Evelyn, a final thought from you?
Yeah, I agree absolutely with that. I think that we've seen no evidence at all that people would prefer not to work. I don't believe that people travel halfway across the world to set up a new life in Canada so that they can live on $20,000 a year and collect benefits. I mean, I think that I think that people are keen to work. I think that what a basic income does is it creates opportunities for people to actually engage in the workforce in reasonable ways. And if we do lose a few jobs in slaughterhouses, in fish packing plants, in the kinds of, backbreaking, horrible work that machines could do, I don't see that as a terrible thing.
Evelyn, Sheila, John, thanks for opening up this can of worms and diving into the discussion. It's been an important one. I appreciate your being here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dave.
Evelyn Forshey is an economist and a professor in community health sciences at the University of Manitoba. Sheila Regehr chairs the Basic Income Canada Network, and John Wright is senior vice president at Maru Public Opinion. Now, coming up in the next episode, we are going to explore the need to address social infrastructure, which includes everything from universal daycare to high-speed internet access, in order to create a foundation for the future that provides resilience, not just for the system, but for the citizens who are struggling with poverty. And we're going to find that one of the biggest challenges in creating solutions is our own cultural and institutional misunderstanding of what it means to live in poverty. Thanks for listening to the 2030 Project. We would encourage you to subscribe to the show. We're on Apple and Spotify, Google, Audible, pretty much anywhere you get your podcasts. We'd also be grateful if you'd offer a rating on the show. We'd love your thoughts, your feedback, even your criticism. The 2030 Project podcast series is sponsored by Daily Bread Food Bank, a Toronto-based charity whose mission is to collaborate with all to eliminate food insecurity and advocate for solutions to end poverty. I'm Dave Trafford, and the 2030 Project is an Eye Contact production.